topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, welcome. Bill Martinez here. Good to have you with us, sharing a part of your day. For more info on the show, you can check it out, BillMartinezShow.com. T. Martin Bennett going to be joining us in just a moment to talk about his brand new book, Wounded Tiger. It's the compelling true story that takes you through the unbelievable challenges that forever changed the lives of Mitsuo Fuchida, Jake DeShazer, and Peggy Covell. The author received the Presidential Award of Entrepreneur of the Year from the Small Business Administration. He became the vice president of a successful nonprofit, trained inmates in federal prison, and lived in poverty on a friend's couch to research this book. So there is a lot behind this book besides the main characters. Martin, welcome to the show. Good to have you with us.
It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to a great conversation.
Okay, my producer asked you up front, and she stole one of my questions before we went on the air, but it's worth mentioning. People will see on the cover of the book, T. Martin Bennett, but of course I refer to you as Martin. So there's a little bit of story behind the T, right?
Yeah, my first name is Tracy, and as a boy, I ended up getting teased having a girl's name. I would end up in girls' PE classes. I remember playing baseball, and they were yelling, Tracy's a girl's name. Tracy can't hit the ball. And I was not a good baseball player. So when we moved from that house, I was going into 9th grade. I said, I just want to use my middle name. So I started using Martin. Nobody confuses Martin with the girl's name.
Right.
Unless it's Marty, then it can be a problem. So I don't use Marty. But when I wrote the book, there's a lot of Martin Bennetts out there. I put the T back in there. And so now it separates me from the rest. And my mom and dad were very apologetic, saying, "Oh, really sorry. We knew some man named Tracy, thought it was a cool name." I said, It's all right. It works for good. Now, if you look up T. Martin Bennett, it's like 2-3 pages of Google results is me in the book and the film project. So
exactly,
it worked out for good.
Yeah, your dad said, "Hey, man, I could have named you Sue."
Boy named Sue, why not? So I tease my kids when they have a son. I said, "Well, you ought to name him Tracy. It's a great guy's name."
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
exactly. Well, again, here it is, your story of just how brutal, the school experience can be. I think I learned at an early age, and then was reminded as I grew older, especially in broadcasting, is you wanted to do as little as possible to offend people, right?
Well, yeah, you can. I understand it, but you got to be yourself, and sometimes it's just offensive. You just got to go with it.
Oh, exactly. Well, I'm glad you survived and you made it here. And so now T. Martin Bennett in the authors category stands out, and you've been well recognized. I think it's an interesting story also that, 8 years of research of this book, you're sleeping on a couch, probably top ramen became your food of choice.
Well, I try to eat healthy and stay healthy, but yeah, you end up buying ramen for, pennies a pack, and you just got to do what you got to do. But I knew the Lord was in this story. It's an unbelievable, true story. It's an unknown story, and it's a very encouraging, positive, and inspiring story that is of Wounded Tiger.
How'd you come to be in contact with this story?
From an early age, I've always loved true stories. I remember I had a 5th grade teacher saying, "Hey, you got to read books in my class," and all the girls cheered and all the guys groaned, and I was one of the guys who groaned like, "Oh, I don't want to read any books."
Right.
Went down to the library.
Yeah, so if they didn't know the difference of your sex, by that point they did, because you groaned with all the boys, right?
Yeah. That was 5th grade, I guess Tracy was okay back then.
Right.
But when I got to 7th and 8th grade, it wasn't so good. Anyway, so I went down to the library. I didn't want to read Pride and Prejudice, all these, classics. And then I see this shelf of biographies. I remember to this day seeing that row of biographies, Henry Ford, Lou Gehrig, and
Right.
Eastman Kodak Film Company and Thomas Edison, Abraham Lincoln. I read every book on that shelf. I've been in love with true stories ever since then.
Right.
So whether it's a movie or book, or whether it has a Christian element or not a Christian element, as long as it's a true story, I'm interested.
Right.
So fast forward, I came across the story of John Newton, who wrote the song Amazing Grace. A friend was reading the book, read me some out of it. I said, well, let me read that book. I read it and I thought, man, one day I'm going to make this into a movie. I just knew that.
Mhm.
And so I eventually, I left, I started a company, and then I didn't need to work anymore. So I spent a couple of years working on this John Newton story, went to England several times, put the story together. It is a phenomenal story.
Yes.
I got the script in front of film people, but I felt like money for it and I didn't have the time for it. I put it off to the side for another day. I met with a producer actually 2 months ago about the John Newton film, and we're very committed to getting it done. But what happened was, about 18 years ago, I stumbled across a used book from a defunct publisher about this guy who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, Mitsuo Fuchida, or Fuchida, depending on how you want to say it. In Japan, they say Fuchida with no accent. In English, we say Fuchida. Doesn't really matter. In any event, I know a lot about history. I love history. I love true stories. I didn't know anything about this guy's life, and my expectations were bombs, planes, and ships, and maybe somewhere at the end he gets religion or something like that. It wasn't anything like that. And as I went through this book, I thought, wow, this is a full-on phenomenal movie. That's what this is. So I spent 3 years researching the story. I met with world's leading authorities. I had critics go through it, met with authors, met with family members. I did everything I could to piece this story together. And the more I researched, the better it got as far as this guy's life story. It is mind-blowing, and I've had dozens of people say Wounded Tiger was the best book they'd ever read in their life, because this story, it's true. If it was fiction, it just wouldn't work.
Right.
So eventually I got in front of film people, and they wanted it. It's a $100 million film. The problem was, if I said yes to an option, I lose all creative control. So I didn't want to do that. It was a deal breaker. So I just took the screenplay and novelized a book form, and that's how we ended up with Wounded Tiger, the book. So that's a short version of why I did the story and why I've stuck with it, is because I love true stories. This is a true story, and without exaggeration, without being dishonest in any way, it's the greatest true story I've ever come across in my life. Wow. And I'm yet to have anybody say anything other than that when they read it.
Well, I'll tell you, that'll compel our viewers to make sure they get their hands on the copy of your book, and to be blessed, by this kind of, this kind of work and the story that is behind Mitsuo Fuchida. What about the two other characters that you intertwine in this true story, Jake and Peggy?
Yeah. So the subtitle of Wounded Tiger is The True Story of the Pilot Who Led the Attack on Pearl Harbor, whose life was changed by an American prisoner and by a girl he never met. So there's actually 3 plot lines in the story. Fuchida is about 50% of the story. Then a guy named Jake DeShazer was an American trying to find his way in the world, get jobs, make money. He was failing at everything. He signs up for the Army because it's it's a job, and you have job security. But after he joined, that's when the attack on Pearl Harbor came, and then suddenly everyone, we're going to war. Well, he was like any other red-blooded American young male saying, I want revenge on the dirty Japanese who did this thing. We're gonna go destroy Japan. So he volunteers on a mission, which he knew nothing about. They wouldn't even tell him, it was so secret. He just had to volunteer or not volunteer. So he volunteers on this mission, and it was the Doolittle raid, which was the first counterattack of the U.S. against Japan. So Pearl Harbor took place December 7th, 1941. The Doolittle raid took place on April 18th, 1942. So it was only a few months later, really. It was very quick.
Right.
Well, the raid was considered to be successful, but his plane ran out of fuel and they had to bail out over occupied Japan. He becomes a prisoner of war, and he was in prison, solitary confinement, tortured, all kinds of horrible things. So that's plot line number 2. And plot line number 3 is the Covell family. They were highly educated teachers and missionaries in Japan. They loved the Japanese people. They volunteered to go to the worst parts of Japan, and Tokyo and Yokohama, to feed people, clean them, wash their hair, and tell them how much God loves them. But when Japan ramped up for war, they realized it was not a safe place for Americans. They were putting people in jail. They fled to the Philippines for safety, where Douglas MacArthur was. And there's 100,000 troops, planes, and all kinds of hardware, they figured, hey, the Japanese will never attack the Philippines. They sent their children back to the United States. The daughter, Peggy Covell, went to a college in upstate New York. And that's the setup of this story. Fuchida wants glory for himself and his nation. Jake DeShazer wants revenge. And Peggy Covell, she wants to demonstrate the love of God to people who believe he doesn't exist. And
Wow.
that's what she did with her life. Is anything that anybody here in this who's listening, they could have a monumental impact on somebody's life just by doing simple acts in love. And that's what she did. So that's the outline of the three stories that eventually come together in a very unpredictable and rewarding way.
Now, you say this intertwining of these three characters is similar to Jesus's pursuit of humanity, right?
Well, I'd say that these plot lines, they're all different people coming from different places. John Newton, who wrote the song Amazing Grace, he said that the kingdom of God is like a port that ships come to from all over the world, different ships on different paths, but they all come to the same port. So in that respect, I'd say, yes, these people's lives were radically different in many different ways, but they all come to the same destination. With Fuchida, he was not seeking God. He was not seeking the gospel. It was only when he started seeing circumstances of where he should have died. This guy was, among many other things, well, his plane was hit by shrapnel or by anti-aircraft fire during the Pearl Harbor raid. Because he was the leader, he was circling that harbor to take notes. He had a map and he was making notes. He actually painted a map and he gave to the emperor. We have a copy of that in the book. So he did these things, and his plane was, because it was out over the harbor so long, it was shot at by anti-aircraft fire. When he got back to his aircraft carrier, his engineer said, hey, listen, I got to show you something. One of his control wires was frayed. It was like that thread you always see.
Right.
It was just a thread. And he said, if this had broken, I mean, he didn't say, he said, look at this. And they said, the gods are with you. Yes. Because that was their belief system. But in retrospect, he was saying, why am I not dead? He's in Hiroshima the day before they dropped the bomb, gets a phone call, leaves to go to another air base. Hiroshima is bombed by the atomic bomb, 90,000 people dead, his hotel vaporized. So after the war, he started thinking, what has happened? Why am I not dead? And then he heard about Jake DeShazer's story, where he tells his testimony in Japanese. He read that. He wanted to read his book. Then he heard about this lady, Peggy Covell, from a man who used to work with him on his aircraft carrier. And he told about the story of this woman loving her enemies. And he started asking questions. Where does this love come from? I think we've been taught you hate your enemies. You kill your enemies. Why would you love your enemies? And he didn't understand that. He wasn't seeking the kingdom of God. He was just seeking truth. Why would anyone love their enemies? When he got that answer, that's when the Lord opened the doors for him. So he wasn't really seeking God. He was just seeking answers to questions. If you seek truth, you end up finding the truth.
Yeah, exactly. And because God says that's what will happen, is that if you keep knocking and keep asking, and you're faithful, to find the answer, God will give it to you. We're talking with Martin Bennett. He is the author of the book Wounded Tiger. It's a true story, and it's phenomenal here. And just so far, what you've laid out here, Martin, I think for Mitsuo Fuchida, for somebody who doesn't know God, but yet I imagine starting to connect the dots. I mean, whether it's a plane that he should not have survived in, an escape, an opportune movement away from, Hiroshima, or he would have been vapored along with 90,000 others, right? And, he's beginning to think, well, wait a minute, what is going on? And, Peggy Covell, living a life of in pursuit of God, is sharing her testimony, and little does he know, or even that we all realize, how these seeds of the gospel go forth, and God says what he sends forth will not come back void, right?
Yeah. So when we, God tells us to obey him, and we say, why? And the Lord is he's kind of vague. He's not necessarily going to tell you why. You'll see why. And I used to, teach Bible to my kids when they were young. And I'd say, there's two ways to find out that God is right about everything. Do what he says, or don't do what he says. Either way, you'll find out that he's right about everything.
Right.
So with Peggy Covell and her family, her dad was a godly man. He was very much against war, and he was a pacifist, to be honest. And I'm not a pacifist, but I think for his life story, it works better that way because he's the perfect person to do the things he did. So with Peggy Covell, she saw the Japanese doing horrible, terrible things and experienced some of these things herself. And she thought, how can I love my enemies? She volunteered to go to an internment camp where Japanese Americans were being held temporarily during the war. And then she ended up volunteering for a hospital for prisoners of war, along with American soldiers. And that's where, because she spoke Japanese, they sent her to the ward of Japanese POWs. Well, one of the POWs was the engineer for Mitsuo Fuchida. And when this guy goes back to Japan, he tells Fuchida about this girl who loves her enemies like you wouldn't believe. And Fuchida says, why would you do that? And it's a great, how these things come together. It's really powerful. But, to answer your question, with Fuchida, that was his story. And that's what started to bring the light of day into the darkness of his life.
The interesting thing that comes out is that he questions it, which, to say, well, why would you do that? I mean, that's a legitimate, heartfelt question that he, in a sense, calls out to the universe. And God says, you know what? He's my guy. I think that I can do something with this guy, right?
Yeah, but it was a long, slow journey for him. And, Japanese culture is very, very different than American culture. And there's also a lot of stigma for anyone to embrace a foreign religion. Shinto is native to Japan, but they're also embraced Buddhism and Confucianism. But Christianity at the time was kind of like, whoa, that's another country's God. We don't honor that God. So for him, he had a lot of things he had to think about as far as becoming a believer, because it meant being ostracized. And to be honest, in this story, a man comes in to execute him because of the choices he's made. And you can see the conversation, but it's absolutely true. So there's also Jake DeShazer. He hated the Japanese people. He ends up in prison being tortured, seeing people die of exposure, execution. And he said in his own words, he was crazy with hatred toward the Japanese.
Wow.
And then at some point he starts thinking, there's got to be a better way to live than living in just steeped in hatred. I don't want to be that person. And he remembered his mom. So this is really an encouragement to moms out there. You don't realize how powerful a position you're in your family with your kids. So what happened was he thinks about her and he decides, I want what she had. And she was a believer and she knew God and she was a loving, forgiving, principled woman, and she had peace and joy. He wanted that, especially in this dark place where pretty good chance he was going to die along with other people he'd seen die. So he starts reading the Bible and he said, is this really true? How could this be true?
Right.
And he started asking questions and finally said, basically, okay, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to do what you say, but you need to prove to me who you are and make it happen. And then you'll see what happens in this prison. It is quite amazing. And then after prison, even more amazing things start happening, naturally amazing and supernaturally amazing things happen in his life as well. And ultimately, he had an impact on Fuchida's life. And ultimately, he meets Fuchida after the war. These are things that if it was a fictional story, it just wouldn't work. They said, Martin, too far out. That's just too weird. The odds of these things happening, millions to one.
Right.
But it actually did happen. It's true. And that's the encouraging thing. If it happened for him, it can happen for you. Seek God out. He's a rewarder of those who seek him.
Exactly. And the fact that what you demonstrate here is that God remains active in our lives. I mean, how much of this could you possibly put up to coincidence if this was not a supernatural act of God upon these three people? This is incredible that, as you say, if it wasn't a true story, then people would say, well, you're out there on a limb with this. You probably wouldn't get a publisher to publish the book.
Well, we did bring it to a publisher, and the problem they had with it, they said, well, women 50 and older buy 50% of all books. They don't read war stories about General Patton in a tank going across Europe. Right. And I said, and my agent said, it's not a war story. It's a character-driven story that takes place in the context of war. And ultimately, my agent said, Martin, they don't care what you think. They don't care what readers think. They care what they think. And they think they can't do anything with the book.
Right.
But the fact is, Wounded Tiger, it's actually, I self-published it on a small scale, but we got hundreds of reviews, and it has a higher 5-star rating than John Grisham's best-selling book, The Firm, his best book of all.
Wow.
So this edition is totally updated, has over 300 photos in it, and it's written in the format of fiction, but it's a true story. So most true stories are nonfiction, but I didn't really care for that, because nonfiction, you're kind of a little bit disconnected. It's like, this happened, they said that, they did this, they. And
it's a little bit more clinical, huh?
Yeah, I wanted to be dynamic, like a movie, like experiencing it. And this is what Truman Capote did with In Cold Blood. And also Michael Shera did this with Gettysburg, which is a true story in the format of fiction. They call it a nonfiction novel. So it's more dynamic, it's more experiential, and it reads like a novel because it is a novel, but it's a true story that we've highly vetted. What I say in the introduction is the essence of every scene in the story is true. And just for your people out there, if they want to read the first chapters free, it's at woundedtiger.com. You can read and decide for yourself what you think of the story.
Yeah, exactly. How does the prayer of St. Francis come into this?
Well, the prayer of St. Francis, it was something that Jimmy Covell, the father of the Covell family, he loved this poem, and it's really a powerful poem. I have not memorized it, so I can't give it to you right now. But the essence of it is, where you see things that are not right, God help me to make it right. When I see a problem, not to complain about it, but to actually participate with the change. Where there's sadness, let me bring joy. Where there's weakness, let me bring strength. It's kind of along those lines. And he read this, he believed it, but more importantly and more powerfully, he lived it. He made choices that other people would never make, and you see it happening in real time. So he had to flee for his life with his wife into the woods in the jungles in the Philippines, and they had to live, hand to mouth, eating whatever they could find, people bringing bananas or whatever else. Their lives were hanging by a thread, and the Japanese were trying to find them and murder them all. That was their goal: kill all Americans on the island. So this belief of doing good where there's evil, of course, that was part of his family philosophy. And his daughter, Peggy, she picked up that banner. And when she saw the Japanese doing evil and terrible things, she thought, how can I show the greatest love to my enemies? But she was a very private person. She was a librarian, very, she wasn't outgoing, flamboyant, somebody you'd vote as personality of the year, not that person. But the impact she had on Fuchida's life was phenomenal. And if she had not done what she did, I would not be talking to you today. And I wouldn't have spent 18 years on Wounded Tiger, the movie, the book. I wouldn't have done it. But she's an inspiration and an encouragement to anyone, a young man, a young woman, or anybody in any place in your life. You'll see what simple acts done in love can have gigantic and monumental impacts on others and the world.
The prayer of St. Francis opens up with, make me an instrument of your peace. And everything else falls under that, because the things that take away and rob us of our peace is when it's all about us. Like one of the lines that stood out for me when I first read it was, help me to understand more than being understood. So it puts you in a subordinate position, and that's where God's peace can reign and where God can use you. And relevant to hate, where there is hatred, let me be an instrument of love, to be that counter agency of those things. And and what Jake has experienced, what Mitsuo Fuchida as well, in terms of hatred. Interesting, Martin, that today hatred is on stage with what's happening with Israel and Hamas. I mean, because you've got ancient hatred. This has been going on for millennia. That's been on display and been targeted towards Israelis. And it's where we are in this world right now, and we're realizing that hatred and love cannot cohabitate, can they?
No, but it's a great opportunity, because the light shines the brightest in the darkness. So Wounded Tiger is not a treatise or a or a lesson about why we should love our enemies. It's a demonstration of the power of God in people's lives who hated each other to the point of killing other people, and then seeing their lives be transformed to where they love people, they forgive people, they ask forgiveness, and they reconcile. So how this happened with Fuchida's life, how this happened in the DeShazer's life, and how the Lord used the Covells to bring peace where there was all this dissension and hatred is a lesson we can learn from by that demonstration. So the world needs to hear the message. We all know there's fighting and killing and wars, but nobody has a solution for it. But the fact is, we do have the solution, and you can see that solution lived out from a person who begins with anger and nationalism and violence and warfare and ending with love and peace and power and joy. How does that happen? You see it in Wounded Tiger, and it's beautiful.
Well, the only way you can make that transition, as you said, some would identify it as something, something supernatural because of the amount of hatred, the dogma that's running so deep within you to think that you must hate your enemy. But it is God himself. It is the hand of God, his Holy Spirit. And because of what Jesus has done on the cross, that we're able to make that transition. There's no political figure. There's no other individual who could possibly affect that kind of transformation, is there?
No. And I tell you, an interesting thing I stumbled across in this story, which is in the book, Fuchida was on USS Missouri when the Japanese surrendered to the Allied forces in Yokohama Bay, September 2nd, 1945. And so I knew that General Douglas MacArthur gave a speech. So I got copies of the speech, and I was going to basically edit it down for the film because I wrote the script for the film first.
Right.
As I'm going through his speeches, I mean, I wasn't even thinking. I was thinking, okay, here's the speech, the war's over, peace, whatever. I'm just thinking it's just like a generic speech, but I wasn't really thinking because, I mean, millions of people had died. I mean, it was a worldwide, global, conflict. And now this war is over. And here is the supreme commander of the Allied forces giving a speech at the surrender ceremonies. I mean, this is an epic speech. But when I go through it, Bill, he says the problem is spiritual. And I think, I cannot believe I'm hearing this.
Right.
So I read this very carefully, and I did print most of it in the book. And he says the world has come to their last chance. We cannot solve this with military might. It is a spiritual problem, and we need to address it on that level. I'm thinking, I agree with him 100%, but it didn't ever cross my mind that Douglas MacArthur would say something like that on the deck of USS Missouri. But he does. And you know what? He's 100% right. We both know it. That conflict ultimately is a spiritual battle, and it's never going to be won on a physical plane.
Exactly. Well, don't you love the truth of God?
I read the Bible every day, and I can't wait to read it because I need truth. You know what, Bill? I've thought about this many times. Every human being on this planet has the exact same obligation to live according to what's true. The closer you live to what's true, the better off your life is going to be. And the further that you live from the truth, the worse it'll be. And the worse your impact will be on everyone and everything else. So yes, we need to live according to the truth. So the first thing we have to do is to seek the truth and commit ourselves that whether I like it or don't like it, I'm going to live according to it because there's no other way to live.
It really is an individual responsibility, isn't it? I mean, we have been conditioned to be told what we should believe, told, how we should react. And we have been saying consistently on this show, I've been admonishing our viewers and our listeners to own your own knowledge, take the responsibility. I mean, for you, look at you commit 8 years of your life to research this book. We need to pursue the truth no matter where it leads and understand who are the truth tellers and who are not. Because right now in this information age in which we live in, the Bible warned us that there would be that time where we would be running to and fro in search of knowledge and we wouldn't find it. And it seems that here it is in this information age when knowledge is right in the palm of your hand, seemingly, but you still need to be not so much a consumer, but a discerner of what this information is, what's the source of this information. Because I've also been saying on the show, Martin, that I wish that when some of these talking heads come on, especially politicians, that there was some sort of notation, like with a movie, when a movie comes up, they tell you whether it's PG or if it's X-rated or R-rated. There should be some sort of validity quotient or truth quotient that is subtitled on some of the names of these people who are put before us, like as if they're authorities, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, that's a great point. So that brings me back to, I wrote the movie first.
Mhm.
I wrote the script for the movie, and movies, they'll say, based on a true story or inspired by a true story, and it's kind of like fruit juice
Yeah,
or fruit
right.
drink. It's
Exactly.
like, well,
10% of the real
it's
juice,
like
right?
how much
Yeah.
sugar water's in this thing, and I think people feel a little bit ripped off. I know I do when I watch a movie. It's a true story, and then you read the notes and the feedback. It's like, no, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. They made this up. You feel kind of like you were cheated. You're kind of lied to. So for
Right.
me, I'm on the exact opposite end of the spectrum. This is a true story, and I have spent a ton of time finding these facts. And I was challenged by some pretty, high-powered people, authors, people who are researchers. Well, how do you know this happened? Where's your facts behind this, Martin? I thought, well, it's actually a good question. I had to drill. But as I said before, and I put in the introduction to the book, the essence of every scene in this story is true.
Mhm.
And that is, I do stand behind that. And that's really the power of it. It's authentic. We don't want a fake story. It's hard to be inspired by a completely fictional story unless there's principles and things, C.S. Lewis and all that. That's good. But for me, a true story that really happened, here's what happened, here's how the life changed, that's very powerful. It's I remember hearing a man of God, older, and a guy who was in his 70s. He said, a man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument.
Exactly.
And that's like the man who was blind and he was healed. And the Pharisees, we know this man is not of God. Tell us what happened. He said, listen, I was blind, now I see, and Jesus Christ did it. You can't argue with that. So in the story of Wounded Tiger, you see these transformations happening, and that God was involved. We have an obligation to live according to the truth. The truth sets people free. The problem is the truth also shows us that we're bad people. We make terrible choices, and we don't like that truth. And I've talked to people like, why are you condemning me? Why are you saying negative things about me? It's like, well, we have to be honest with ourselves if we're going to progress. What is it? Shakespeare, to thine own self be true.
Exactly.
And in the scripture says, don't lie to yourself, or you're lying to yourself. So truth means being humble too. If you're going to seek the truth and find the truth, you have to be humble enough to say, if the shoe fits, wear it. I should not have done that thing. I shouldn't have said this, or whatever it is. And Fuchida was humble enough that when he followed that path of truth, he found the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. And God says he's a rewarder of those who earnestly seek him. And so I encourage people to do that. But it's fun to see that journey, like I said, in John Newton's life, and of course in Fuchida, DeShazer, and the Covell's family, to see how these three stories have nothing to do with each other, each of them figuring out how to follow what's good, right, and true, and how it all pays off in the end of like unimaginably good things happen.
Exactly. Well, and as you say, and it's interesting, you should use Shakespeare's "To thine own self be true." I think the first time I saw that, I was 7 years old. I was in a bus going to school, public transportation, and they had these little billboards up there, and that was one. And when I read that at 7, I said, "There's something very profound about that," and it stayed with me, to this day. It drives my life. And the thing that is a bit of a challenge, I mean, first of all, you need to understand that nobody's perfect. We've all fallen short of God's glory, right? And when you understand that, then it not that it excuses misbehavior, but it starts to build some character and give you some footing to where when you are wrong and you admit it, the quicker you admit it, the better off you are. And the less damage you and effect you can have on others. Because like you said, the power of the truth is it's very infectious, and it's encouraging, it's uplifting to others. And the converse is true. And that is the power of a lie, how destructive that can be, to your kids, to your family, to your wives, business relationships, and on, right?
Yeah, and sometimes they couch this in, you got to be realistic.
Mhm.
And they'll say, I'm just being honest, I'm just being realistic, but they're denying the potential of good things. So in this story, Jake DeShazer had a godly mom, and she was hoping that her son was okay, but there was no news. Nobody knew. The Japanese wouldn't say. And they did have in the newspapers, some of these prisoners were executed. And then there was actually a news report that came out that her son was executed.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't confirmed. And they said, so what do you think about this? She says, well, I've always believed that my son was alive, but I don't know. And then she
Yes.
starts crying. She goes back in the house. And I found this fact, and it was mind-boggling when I came across this. But what happened was, that night, she just randomly opens the Bible. She comes across this verse that says, your son will not die. He will come home again.
Wow.
And she just grabbed that. She wrote it down, and she said, praise the dear Lord Jesus Christ. So then, as the war progressed, no news on her son. Her family was like, hey, I don't think he's going to make it. She goes, no, he's coming back. I'm positive he's coming back. And nobody could dissuade her. And they felt sorry for her because she lived in this pretend dream world. She wasn't being realistic. She wasn't being honest. But what she was doing was she was living according to the truth, because the Lord speaks the truth. And sometimes he actually does people a favor by telling them ahead of time, like he did with Joseph and like he did with many other people.
Exactly.
And he told his mom, your son is coming back alive. So she had to go through a lot of garbage of people, friends, well-meaning people, friends, trying to say, hey, he's gone, just admit it. Stop living in a pretend dream world. So she was living according to truth, though. And of course, I wouldn't be saying this if it wasn't true. He does come back alive, and how all that happens is really an amazing story, and it's an encouraging story. So sometimes truth is like it's written in the Bible. We know it. Sometimes truth is just physics and math and science. And sometimes truth is the Lord speaks a word to you, and it's from him. You just got to have to put all your chips on it. If you were Noah, you're building this boat. They're saying there's no water here. There's no river. There's no lake. What are you doing?
Right.
You say, well, I'm doing what the Lord's led me to do. That's the truth. We have to live that way too. But you have to know the shepherd in order to be able to recognize his voice.
Exactly. Can you imagine? I can barely imagine as a mom what she must have gone through in being so worried about her son. And God knew that this was going to hurt her heart, that this was a burden for her to carry for too long a period of time, because God knew that her son was going to be imprisoned, and she was not going to hear any news of him being alive or dead. But God's hand was upon his life to keep him alive, no doubt about it. And God, gave her this comfort. It gave her a sense of peace. We're talking about peace again. God doesn't want us walking around like, the walking wounded. His peace is shalom. He sends to her to comfort her and carry us through this time. But you see, we get back to the truth again, Martin. The truth before used to be a defense, and you can no longer rely on the truth as a defense. It becomes an offense in this current culture because it does not know God.
Yeah, truth can be offensive, but if we love the truth, we just have to be honest and say, if the shoe fits, we're going to wear it.
Exactly.
And just be aware that sometimes we just don't know the truth. I think it's healthy for Christians to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, the disciples asked Jesus, well, when is all this going to happen? And his answer, in essence, was, I don't know.
Yeah.
Only the Father knows. So
Right.
It's okay to say we don't know. That's the truth of the matter. We don't need to conjure up an answer. But
Right.
with DeShazer's mother, Jake DeShazer, the war ended and we had victory, and there was still no news what happened to the prisoners. And the Japanese had said, both internally and externally, if we lose the war, we're just killing all the prisoners. We're just going to kill them all, because they would be, of course, witnesses to all these war crimes, and they didn't want that to happen. They'll just get rid of all the evidence by killing them. And many of the POWs considered that that's probably what would happen, including Jake DeShazer. but that's not what happened. And of course, the Lord spoke to him too, that he was going to live as well. He was dying and he was thinking, this is it. And the Lord said, no, he had a purpose for him and he saved him. And it's amazing what happened in his life and how that all worked out.
Exactly. We're talking with Martin Bennett. He's the author of Wounded Tiger, a true story that was written, for a movie. And Martin, this is so ripe, for a movie. I can't wait to see it on the big screen. These stories of faith that you have captured, that you've shared with the audience, that you have, in a sense, been baptized in. I mean, how have these faith stories changed you?
Well, we all have difficult circumstances in life. Myself, some very difficult ones. Like I said, I had a lot of money through choices that didn't have anything to do with me. I ended up with nothing. And I slept on my son's couch for a year while I was working on this book, among other things. I was a security guard working for minimum wage in the desert. But I wasn't involved in anything like what these guys went through on both the American and the Japanese side, the horrific conditions, the death, just terrible, terrible things. But you say, if God helped them in their circumstances, then I believe he can help me. So it's broadened my horizon to say there's no circumstance that God can, it's like, well, it's too tough. I just can't work anything out on this.
Right,
it's,
exactly.
we serve a God, it says that he's able to do infinitely more than we would ask or even imagine. Well, if that's true, we should live that way. And when you see these kinds of things happening, like in Wounded Tiger, people's lives being changed and transformed, and where something seems like it's impossible for anything good to come out of this, everyone's dead. Well, how does that work? And the Lord says, well, I'm going to show you how this is going to work. And you're like, okay, that's amazing. I had somebody who read the book and they sent me a review like last week. And they said, Martin, she was saying, I was thinking, I thought you were tooting your horn, was what she said. And she was like, you're just like bragging about this story. I said, no, I like the story. But she said, so I read the book. She said, Martin, this is an amazing story. I was crying, real tears. I was just, this is an absolutely astounding story. It's got to be a film. So you can't explain a story. You have to experience the story.
Exactly.
And that was Wounded Tiger. And it's encouraging and inspiring to people.
Well, that's one testimony. I'm sure you've got many more that you can share with us.
Sure. So I had a friend, actually, she was a new acquaintance, not a believer, but very liberal in her philosophy, not a churchgoer in any way, shape, or form. And I said I wanted her to read a pre-release version of the book. She's Japanese American, highly educated, and I discussed it with her. She said, so she's asked me a bunch of questions. Is Hirohito in this story? I said, yeah, the Emperor of Japan is actually a key figure in this story. And she said, you say this is a true story? I mean, are you making stuff up or is this true? I said, it's a true story. I'm not making any of this stuff up. Then she looks at me and she says, Martin, I don't think I'm going to like this book. And she worked for a newspaper that did book reviews. She said, if I read your book and I don't like it, I'm going to write a negative review. I said, well, I'm not asking to like the book. Maybe you won't like it. You don't need to like the book, but see what you think. So she then read the book, and then a few days later, she sent me an email. Said, Martin, unbelievable story. I'm going to get you a book table. I'm going to help you out. She wrote a positive review. And then I was in a restaurant. I took her and her husband to dinner. Did I mention this before? I took them to dinner.
No, you didn't. You didn't mention it.
I did 2 other reviews today, 2 other interviews. So I took her and her husband to dinner just for fun. We went to a Japanese restaurant, had a good time, how they met and just whatever. And then about 3/4 of the way through the dinner, she took off her glasses. Tears start coming down her cheeks. She said, Martin, I got to tell you something. This story hit me really hard. My mother treated us horribly. She was very mean to us, and I hated my mom for how she treated us. And even at the time, her mom was still alive. She said, I still find myself hating my mom. She would lock us in the basement. We'd scream and cry and bang on the door. She was just an evil person. But she said, when I saw what these people did in this story, how they loved each other, I felt I need to be a better person. And I thought to myself when she said this, well, that's a good starting place to say I need to be a better person. That's the pathway to the kingdom of God. So we've remained friends ever since. But what I've seen, Bill, over and over is that this story opens doors with just about every kind of person there is, because there's something that people identify with that as being authentic and true. In the same sense, if somebody, ran out and took off his shirt and jumped, broke through the ice to rescue somebody and save their life, when he gets back to the shore, you'll be amazed that was amazing. You don't say, wait a second, are you white? Are you black? Are you old? Are you young? Are you a Christian? Are you atheist? We don't care. We just
Right.
say that was a good thing. And that's what you see in Wounded Tiger over and over. Things happening like, man, that's amazing. How did that happen? And even like the story of Sharma Covell and of the DeShazers and of Fuchida's family, when you see how these things happen, I mean, it brings tears to your eyes. And I had one review. This woman said, "I just finished your book. Now I'm picking up the Kleenex off the floor." I mean, she said, I was just blown away. I had an interviewer like you who said, "Martin, I don't have time to read a book like this." I said, "You don't need to read the book. Just flip through a few pages here and there." She said, "Fine, but I'm not reading the book." I said, it doesn't offend me. It's okay. You can do the interview. It'll be fine. So like 2 days before the interview, she said, "Martin, I sat down on Saturday, started flipping through this book, started reading it. And I kept reading it and reading it and reading it. I've read the entire book and the sun went down. And this is one unbelievable story. I've never read a story quite like this before."
Yeah. What a blessing. Speaking of Fuchida, we got about 4.5 minutes, maybe 4 minutes left here, Martin. I do want you to share with the audience, this pivot point, and this dramatic change in Fushida's life that brought him to know Christ.
Well, without spoiling the story for potential readers, the turning point came with this convergence of God helping him when he was a hateful, evil person, and God doing good things for him, saving his life time after time, where almost all of the people he was with on the Pearl Harbor raid after the war, almost all these guys are dead. And after when they looked at surrender, a lot of officers killed themselves. It's something that Fuchida even looked at. And then seeing that the life of Jake DeShazer, who was in the U.S. Army Air Corps, which was the precursor to the Air Force, he admired him for their guts to come and attack Japan straight across the ocean, go right to downtown Tokyo. Even though he was the enemy, he respected him as being a warrior. When he read his testimony about what happened in his life with God, that was just like, what are you talking about? He didn't quite grasp it. And then Peggy Covell's story coming to him through his former engineer, who he thought his engineer was dead from the Battle of Midway. They had no report of him. They thought he went down with the ship. What happened was he got picked up by Americans and taken to the United States and brought to a hospital. So the answer to the question was a convergence of all these things at the same time, and then reading the truth of the gospel. Can you imagine reading the gospel and not knowing anything about it as you go through the story? I mean, from an early age, my mom told me the Bible stories and I went to church and everything. He knew nothing. So when it comes to the crucifixion, and I cannot tell you what it was about it, but it hit him so hard, that was the breaking point. He was done, and he just gave his life to God.
Well, what a great story. Thank you for giving us a little tease on that for our viewers that'll want to get their hands on your book, Wounded Tiger, that's available. How can they get their hands on it, Martin?
Well, you can go to woundedtiger.com and you'll see it there. You can pre-order it. It'll be released November 7th. You can read the first chapters free. I think it's 8 chapters you can read. There's also a sizzle reel that shows what an idea of the movie might look like. And there's more information about the book and myself as well. But it will be on Amazon as well, but it's not live yet. It's not available for pre-order, but the release date is November 7th. And of course, the anniversary is December 7th. Exactly. And I think for that reason, it'll be of great interest. You mentioned
great timing.
Yeah. So
without a doubt.
It's a story of hope and inspiration. And I've found people of all walks of life find something in this story that really hits them in a good way.
Well, a major theme, and this will be the final question here for you, Martin, is forgiveness. That is so obvious in this book, right?
Yeah, the way I put it is you cannot give what you do not have. And if you need to forgive somebody else, you need forgiveness first. And Fuchida realized that he had done terrible, horrible things. Now, we all justify our past. We have all kinds of reasons. Well, I was in the military and I followed orders or whatever. But at some point, you have to take personal responsibility for your decisions. And you got to say, it's my fault. I'm responsible. Forgive me, And when we receive forgiveness, then we're able to give that forgiveness. That's the river of living water that flows out. So, for me personally, I forgive everybody, everything all the time, continuously. Guy cuts you off in traffic, I forgive him, and I hope he has a great life.
As quickly as possible. Exactly.
Yeah,
You don't want to meditate on hate and evil, right?
yeah, so I'm not going to be a road rager. I'm a forgiver. You know what? I sleep soundly at night. I forgive everybody everything because God forgave me everything.
Amen. Well, Martin Bennett, thank you so much for being with us. Congratulations on the book. We look forward to its full release come November. And when do you think it's going to be on the big screen? Can you give us a little tease on that?
How many minutes do we have left here?
We're down to the last seconds. Go ahead.
Well, the producer Hacksaw Ridge called me up. An attorney said, we've got a billionaire interested in the project. It's going to be done sooner or later. I expect by early 2024, we'll start in pre-production.
How much fun is that? And that'll be another reason for us to get back together. Okay.
Absolutely. Love to talk with you again, Bill. Thank you.
Look forward to it. Martin Bennett has been our guest. He's the author of Wounded Tiger. Stay tuned for more details. Undoubtedly, they will be coming your way. Well, our thanks to Martin, for being with us. We're so grateful for him to take the time to tell us about his book, Wounded Tiger. And we thank you, for being with us to share in the experience of hearing about these incredible stories, a true story. And of course, you'll read it for yourself. And as Martin warned, bring tissues. Okay. So our thanks to Martin Bennett for being with us today. For more information and to be a part of this mighty movement to return to God and to save our country, check it out, BillMartinezShow.com. May God bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you. May he be gracious unto you and give you peace. Thanks again for being with us. Take care.